This meeting is being recorded.
I want to welcome everybody to our session today, hosted by Dr. Jessica Harrell, our Director of Institutional Effectiveness and Research here at Blue Ridge Community College. We're so glad that Dr. Harrell can be with us today to talk about how we can best protect student data. I'm going to turn the session over to Jessica. I want to remind everybody that you are welcome to ask questions. You can put those questions in the chat, or you can take yourself off mute and ask a question as we go. As long as Jessica's open to that, you're okay with that during the session, Jessica? Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and turn it over to Dr. Harrell. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Sarah. For those of you who don't know me, I am the Director of Planning, Research, and Institutional Effectiveness at the college. And what that basically means, I'm the data nerd on campus, so I do a lot of work with student data. I work quite a bit with the registrar in summarizing information. So the registrar is taking in information and I am processing that information and then putting it out so that we can see trends in student enrollment and student success. I started life as a political scientist. So I have training in social science research and quite a bit of experience using data, protecting data, and protecting participant privacy. So I've kind of done it from both the academic end and then in my role as a staff member. So as we get started today, can't move my slide forward. Here we go. So there are three things I'm going to go through today. We're going to start with a review of FERPA. And that might not be the most exciting thing for you to think about, but actually FERPA underlines everything that we do with student data, whether it's in your classroom, it's outside the classroom, within the college, and outside of the college. So we need to have a pretty good understanding of FERPA regulations before we can start talking about how we protect student data outside of the classroom. Once we go through FERPA, we'll talk a little bit about some best practices, kind of everyday things that you should be doing to protect student data. And then we're going to talk about using student data outside the classroom. And when I say outside the classroom, I'm talking about giving, for example, presentations, like maybe you're going to a conference and you're going to talk about some of the best practices that you've used in the classroom. It could be maybe on my end, creating a dashboard for public view on a website. Okay, maybe it's publishing some sort of a paper. All of these are great things. We encourage people to do these things, but we do need to be very mindful of protecting student data and protecting student privacy when we do that. So let's jump in. Let's start with FERPA. What is FERPA? That's the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. It was passed in 1974. This is a federal law, and it governs how we protect and disclose student educational records. So the act, it does three main things. It defines students' rights regarding their education records. It specifies the conditions under which student education records may be shared within the college. And it specifies the conditions under which student education records may be shared outside of the college. So it covers any possible use that we might have with student education records. So in order to really understand what FERPA is telling us, we need to first define what an educational record is. An educational record is any information that's recorded in any form. That could be handwritten notes, it could be typed, it could be on a film, it could be on a computer file. So any form that information is recorded that is directly related to a student and is maintained by the college. So some examples of that would obviously official academic records of a student related to their course enrollment, grades, graduation, their course schedules, class lists and rosters are considered academic records. If a student is working with us, say in a work study position, their employment records for that work study position would also be considered an educational record. Any kind of disciplinary records that the college has related to a student is part of their educational record. And finally, financial records. And that would include financial records of a parent or a spouse as well. So all of these things are considered educational records, and thus they fall under FERPA guidelines. If you have a record, one special category of information that is not considered part of a student's educational record are sole possession records. So if I'm teaching a course and I make notes to myself about the students in my class, and I'm not intending and I don't share that with anyone else, it's just for me, then that is not considered an educational record. But that's only if you're not sharing it with anyone else. So that's what that sole possession means. There are some other exceptions related to law enforcement, medical and health, any kind of health records. Those are not considered educational records. But the things that would affect us most are probably going to be those sole possession records. So the main thing to remember are these main categories here that we have up on the slide. So we also need to be clear about who we consider to be a student. A student is an individual who is attending or has attended the college. It does not include people who are not admitted to the college or who have been admitted but didn't actually attend. So they do not fall under these protections. And attendance starts as soon as the individual matriculates or declares their intention to enroll at Blue Ridge, whichever comes first. Okay, so there's a pretty specific definition too of who counts as a student. The feds are always very specific when they talk about their laws and regulations. So we said that one of the things that FERPA does is it defines student rights related to their education records. So students have the right to inspect and review their education records. They have the right to request amendments of information that they think is inaccurate or otherwise inappropriate in their education record. They have the right to consent to disclosure of their educational record. We can't do that ourselves, but the student can give consent for disclosure. And students also retain the right to file a complaint concerning failure by the college to comply with the requirements of FERPA. I should mention that the college, we've taken this regulation and we have incorporated it into our own policies and procedures. And if you were to go on our website to the policies and procedures manual, you would see we have a policy related to the confidentiality of student records. And all of that contains this information in FERPA, and it makes it very specific to the offices and the organization of Blue Ridge Community College. So I just said that we can't release education records until we get consent from a student. So if we were to disclose any kind of non-directory information about a student, we have to have prior written consent from the student. Prior written consent means that we are going to tell the student exactly what records are going to be released. We will make sure that the student understands the purpose of the disclosure and why we want to disclose this information. We will identify the party or the parties to whom the disclosure is going to be made. And we have to have the signature and date by the student confirming that they agree to let us disclose this information. If we don't have this prior written consent, then we have violated the rules of FERPA. And you don't want to violate rules, especially when they come from the federal government. Now, I said non-directory information. Oops. So we can release non-directory, or we can release directory information about students without getting their consent. So this is one exception to that prior written consent rule. Here at Blue Ridge, we consider directory information to be the student's name, their county of residence, the dates that they have attended Blue Ridge, and any kind of credential, whether it's a degree, a diploma, or a certificate, or any kind of award that they may have received at Blue Ridge. Directory information also includes the student's field of study or their program, any participation that they might have had in officially recognized activities from the college, and the student's photograph. So if we could release any of this information about students without getting prior written consent from the student, unless, there's a catch, unless the student has specifically asked us not to release that information. So directory information is an opt-in for the student. It doesn't automatically apply, so we can release it unless or until a student withdraws that consent. So the other main exception to this prior written consent is that college officials with a legitimate educational interest, and that's important, but college officials with a legitimate educational interest may also access student educational records, and you as an instructor or as a staff member, whoever, that you hold a student's educational record, you can release that information to other college officials. And so a college official, it's an employee with a general or even a specific responsibility for promoting the educational objectives of the college. So that could be instructors, it could be advisors or counselors, it could be perhaps health staff, HR, well, maybe not HR. I'm thinking of Kirsten, the student, my brain is going, the student, I want to say student success, that's not.
He's VP
but
of Student Services?
Yes, thank you. Student services, folks in student services would be considered a college official, okay? So that kind of is going to cover most of us here at the college, but the important key here is legitimate educational interest. And what that means is that you have a reason to look at that student's education record in order to fulfill your professional responsibilities. If it's not part of your professional responsibilities, then you do not have a legitimate educational interest. And therefore, you really should not be looking at a student's education record. So in my case, I can go into Colleague and Informer, and I could pull information about any student I wanted to. But I can do that as my job if I'm pulling information because I'm getting ready to provide an enrollment update and I need to see who's enrolled in a specific course. Or if I'm giving course success rates, right? The VP, the CAO has asked for how many students passed English 111 this year. I can pull all of those grades, and that is within my responsibility here at the college. I have a legitimate educational interest. But if I find out that my neighbor's kid is enrolled in English 111, and I just want to know, I wonder how they did in that class. Did they pass? Did they make a C? How did they do? That is not a legitimate interest. And so I cannot look at that student's grade just out of curiosity. And if I do so, then I'm violating FERPA rules. So being a college employee is not the only qualification that you need to look at education records. You need to have a legitimate interest. It needs to be part of your professional responsibilities. And even when you do have access to information, it doesn't mean that you have unrestricted use for that data. Okay, there are still restrictions on when and how you use that information, and it does not give you the authority to share that information with a third party. So I feel like I'm going through all of this pretty fast. Does anyone have any questions or concerns about anything? All right. So let's keep going then. So that's kind of the overview of FERPA. And given that overview, there are some things that you should be doing in your everyday role as you are teaching, advising, working here at the college. And some of these you may think are kind of fussy, but these things don't matter until they do. And so it's always best to be safe and to be overly cautious than to leave yourself possibly exposed to having a FERPA violation. So the first thing, you should never leave student papers, exams, any kind of student work unattended. So if you're sitting at your desk and you're grading papers and you need to get up to use the restroom, or you're going to go talk to somebody or whatever, do not leave those papers sitting out on your desk. Either lock your office, or you need to put those papers somewhere locked so that they are inaccessible to other people. So again, it may seem kind of fussy, like I know who's here, but you really should not do that. It should not be left unattended. You should keep your work and non-work tasks and communications completely separate. And I think IT would back me up on this. You should not use a personal laptop or computer to do your work. You should use a college issued laptop or computer to do college related work. You shouldn't mix up your personal email with your work email. And in fact, when you're communicating with students, it should always come from your Blue Ridge account.
Jessica,
So,
I have a quick
yeah.
question about that as it relates to our part-time instructors. We don't issue laptops to our part-time instructors, so they do inevitably have to use their personal computers. And I don't know if there are suggestions you would give around that. Their courses are taught through the LMS, so it's all cloud-based. But if you've got any suggestions around that, that would be great.
Try to keep all of your work, I guess, in the cloud, and be mindful of using things like thumb drives or viruses. Like try to keep that information as separate as possible from your personal work. And I'm sure that IT might have some specific guidelines, since they aren't issuing official college laptops or hardware for that. But be really mindful of that, and don't mix up, at the very least, don't mix up your emails. If you're working, then work. And when you're done working, log out of everything that is related to your work, and then move on to your private activities. So keep a wall between those as much as possible. I'm not sure that I've never noticed anyone doing this here, but don't leave your computer unattended when you are logged in, especially if you are using something very sensitive like Colleague. I've seen other people at other institutions do this, and don't do that. That's horrible. That leaves you wide open. Anyone could just walk in and start going through Colleague or going through sensitive files. That is a huge red flag, and you will get in a lot of trouble if anyone catches you doing that. So just don't. That's easy to do. You can just log off, lock your computer, and walk away. And you shouldn't really have Colleague open anyway if you're not actively working in it. So just something to remember. Back in my day, it was common for instructors to, especially in large classes, to post a long list with a student ID number and your grade on an exam. Don't do that. Don't post grades. Do not leave a box of papers, graded papers, for students to come pick up. You shouldn't leave any kind of student grade or graded assignments in any publicly accessible area. That's a really bad idea, and you are likely violating FERPA regulations, because anyone can come along, get that information about that student, and know how they performed. And even, we'll talk a little bit about this later, even if you did just have a student ID number and you say, well, no one knows what people's student ID number is. Well, someone could get that number, and then perhaps they are able to access a different source of information that does have names attached to student ID numbers, and then they could piece those things together. And now you have an unauthorized disclosure of student information. So be careful of that. Related to keeping your work and your personal things separate, use college authorized software. I know that there's a lot of cool stuff coming out, but before you start integrating third-party apps or other kinds of software, make sure it's been vetted first through IT, because a lot of times we are putting in what would be considered an education record about the student into these third-party applications. And we need to make sure that they are also protecting that information. So remember, FERPA doesn't give, just because we have the right to see the education record, it doesn't give us the right to disclose that to a third party automatically. Okay, we need to make sure that there are protections in place. And so that it's just always a good idea to use authorized software only and to talk to IT first before you bring in something new for your class. Another thing that maybe, back in the old times when I was a student, wasn't really thought about, but don't pass around printed class rosters with student IDs and names for attendance, because remember, class lists are considered an education record. So if you want to use some sort of a sign-in sheet to take attendance, just have a blank sheet and have a student write their name and move on. Okay, don't have it already printed out with names and IDs, because someone could take that, make a copy of it, and that's an education record. And finally, do not conduct research or make presentations or write articles that you want to have published somewhere, even if it's on your own personal website or blog, that uses student information without first getting college approval. College approval may be simply letting your supervisor know and talking to your supervisor about it. It might be something that requires a more extensive review, which might start in my office, depending on what it is you're doing. But just make sure that if you're doing something outside your classroom that involves student information, get approval from someone first. Talk to your supervisor first before you go through with that. So are we good? Everyone still, any questions or comments about any of those recommendations?
We do have a question in the chat from Carol. She's
Okay.
asking if there are no student ID numbers, just the names and the class name, is that okay? For like an attendance sheet, sorry.
So if it's just the name and the course, is that
Yeah,
what?
that's the question, yes.
That is still considered an education record. So probably not. I mean, look, I understand that these are things that have a very low probability of leading to a disclosure or in some way that adversely affects students. I understand that. It's a low probability, high risk, or a highly consequential, a bad outcome if that were to become a disclosure in a way that impacts students. So yeah, a class list is considered an education record. So it is best that you don't print those out and pass those around. Better to just take the role yourself or to have students sign their name and do it that way rather than having that all printed out.
Thank you,
It's fussy,
Jessica.
but any other questions? All right.
I
So
have
now
a
we're going to
question
talk
for
about,
you. And I have
yeah.
a question about my course. I copied one of my courses to, begin working on that. And whenever I created that copy, there was a picture in the course that, um, I don't know if, let me get some clarification. There was a picture in my course that had a warning about parents viewing information in the course or something. There was a beginning section of the course whenever I was given a copy of it. Do you know anything about that? And maybe that's specific to working with dual enrollment, but I saw that warning that was in the class about parents viewing information and that type of information. Maybe you're aware of what I'm talking about, maybe not.
Not specifically, so that might be worth following up with your supervisor. Generally speaking, if a student is
Yeah, it
under
was a
the age
warning
of
for
18,
parents,
it was,
that kind of a disclaimer. Make sure, anyway.
well, I was going to say that generally speaking, these rights, if a student is under the age of 18, then the parent um, can see these educational records, and they're the ones that would be granting consent to share things. I'm not sure if the warning was about the parents looking at content in the course. I would need to know more specifically about the course and what the content was to give you a good answer. So I apologize that I can't really answer your question, but it might be worth checking in with your
Yeah.
supervisor just to
I,
clarify.
I I felt like that was probably what you would say. But really, it was a new experience for me. I hadn't seen anything like that before, even teaching at other high schools. But seeing that disclaimer, I was curious about how the differences between the dual enrolled and the regular enrolled students. But anyway, it's interesting. It's something to look into.
Definitely. And it is kind of strange that we have to deal both with um, minors, students under the age of 18, and also adults. Once you're over 18, all of these rights revert to you, and the parent no longer has a right to look at the education records unless the student grants them that permission. Um, so we get to deal with all aspects of FERPA. Are there any other questions or?
I think we're good.
All right, so now we're going to get into the fun stuff, and that's using student data outside of the classroom. This is why you should learn FERPA and know all about education records, because even when you move outside of the classroom or off the campus, FERPA regulations still apply, and we are still under the obligation to protect student data. You still have to have written consent from students if you want to show their work, like a specific work item that a student has done, or even if you are going to present data that's disaggregated, meaning you're showing individuals, you haven't like condensed everything down into say like an average, right? You're showing each individual grade or each individual student's work. You can't do that until you get written consent from the students. When you use student data, you also cannot include personally identifiable information. And sometimes this can be a little bit trickier than it sounds. I mean, it's pretty straightforward until you start getting into it. And we could go way into the weeds with it. I'm just going to show you one example coming up. But it does get a little tricky sometimes, making sure that you don't have that identifiable information. If you are doing human subject research, and this is a special case, this is usually going to apply, since we're not a research institution, this would usually apply if you were working on, like say, a master's degree or a doctorate degree, in which case at some point you will be doing research. And if it involves human subjects, then you would have to go through an additional procedure. The privacy and the FERPA regulations still apply, but there's also a separate process that goes through an IRB that is looking out for the well-being of the people that are participating in your research. We also have a policy about that in our policies and procedures manual, so you can take a look at that as well. I think probably in a future presentation, we will talk more about what that IRB process looks like. But just understand that that might be another set of regulations that you'll have to follow when you're sharing student data outside the classroom. All right, so let's talk about personally identifiable information, because on its face, this is pretty straightforward. So this is any kind of information that a person could use to potentially either that information by itself or combined with other pieces of information to identify a person or link information to a student. And so that could include, but certainly not limited to, a student's name, obviously, the name of the student's parents or other family members, the address of the student or the student's family, any kind of personal identifier like a social security number, a student ID number, biometric records like maybe a thumbprint or something. Any kind of personal identifier that marks a student should not be disclosed. There are other kinds of indirect identifiers, such as a student's date of birth, or maybe their place of birth, or potentially their mother's maiden name. So those are specific examples, but in general, like I said, any information that either by itself or in combination with other pieces of information can be used to link to a specific student, that would be considered personally identifiable information. So, and then that would again put us in violation of rules regarding student privacy. There can also be a circumstance under which maybe there's a person that we think knows the identity of a student, and they're requesting information. And if we disclose that to that person, then that might also be considered a violation of privacy rules. So we wouldn't want to release information in that circumstance either. So this category F here, that's what makes this PII start to get kind of tricky. I think we can all remember to not put a student's name on something, right? So given that we can include this identifiable information, two things that are the easiest way to avoid disclosure. One is remove that identifiable information, such as a name or a person's address or their student ID number. So mark that out. And when you do that, make sure you're using software that's specifically designed for redacting. A few months ago, when I was preparing a report for our accrediting body, I had a number of files that had specific student information, their name, their student ID number. And the person who sent that information to me only used a marker to mark it out. Well, you can still see that information underneath that marker. And most of the time, just marking through it with a pen or something, that's not sufficient to remove that information. And a really motivated person can still see that information. Other things, like if you go in manually into, say, a Word document or something, and you can add a shape and then fill it in with black, it looks like you have sufficiently removed that, but someone can go back in behind you and take that off. And now that identifiable information is now exposed. So you really should try to use software that is specifically made and intended to use to redact information. And that way you know that that information has successfully been redacted and someone can't go back in behind you and recover it. The other really easy way to avoid disclosure is do not present individual student data or student work. Aggregate that information, whether you are reporting grades in English 111 or whether you are showing survey results. Aggregate it as much as possible. But even aggregation, it's a great idea and you should do it, but it's not always sufficient. And this is what I mean when this PII starts to get kind of tricky. Okay, so I'm going to show you an example here. So this is a very generic table, but it's something common that we might see, particularly on a dashboard, or if we were reporting out, like maybe we had this new program that was supposed to increase, we're going to call it math proficiency here. It doesn't specify, but we'll say math proficiency. And maybe we had introduced a new program to help students learn math, and we're evaluating the effectiveness of that intervention that we've added. And so we present our results, and you can see that American Indian, that category, that subgroup has been, those numbers have not been presented, okay? And usually if you have a number of students, the absolute lowest level would be 5. If you have less than 5 students in a category, you really shouldn't present that information. If there's too few people in that category, and it would be pretty easy for folks to find out, to kind of reverse engineer and figure out who that is. Other standards might go as high as 10. 10 students, that's kind of a judgment call for you, but certainly you wouldn't want to report something that's less than 5 students. So this person did that. They did not include the results for the American Indian. They didn't include the number of students, and they didn't include the percent that were proficient. Do you guys see any kind of flaws in this table in the way that they've presented this information? Anyone at all want to take a chance? Quiet group. So if you look at the table, so we have groups divided by their race, ethnicity, and we also see that they are divided by their gender, whether they're male or female. If I go down here to male and female, these are all the students, right? So I can figure out, oh, there are 86 total students. If I add these numbers up, then I see, oh, well, that means that there must be 1 student who is an American Indian. So even though the person has marked out, they didn't show the actual number, we can take the information that's already there and we can figure it out. And with 1 student, if there's only 1, we can figure out who that person is, right? There are other issues with it. We can figure out whether that 1 American Indian student was proficient or not. So if I look at the number of students, I've got 15 Asian students, and I know that 87.7% of them were proficient. I can multiply that by 15 to get, okay, that means that 13 out of the 15 students were proficient. I can do that for all of these categories here. I can also do it down here for male and female. And when I do it for male and female, okay, I've got 38 out of 45 females that were proficient, 32 out of 41 males that were proficient. I can add that up. There were 70 total students who were proficient. You know what the next step is?
There's some subtraction, I think.
There is. So if I know that there's 70 total proficient students, I can add up the number that are proficient up in the race, ethnicity, and I can use that. Okay, well, if I add these numbers up, well, that equals 70 minus 70. So that means that this 1 American Indian student wasn't proficient. So even though this person made a good faith effort to protect this student's information, we can still go back and find it. So that's what I mean, that aggregating is good. And you think it's easy to keep out personally identifiable information, but in this case, we can figure out how this individual student performed. Right, there we are, 0%. So a better way to handle this would be to have a complementary group that you also exclude. Now, if we remember on the last one, we had 12 Black students. So that doesn't really fall under our threshold of too few students. So normally we could show this information, but if we want to protect the American Indian student, Black is our next lowest subgroup. So if we exclude that as well, okay, well, now we don't have enough information to be able to figure out things, because now we would have to figure out how many Black students and how many American Indian students there are. And we can't do that. We don't have enough information. So adding in a complementary group to suppress, in this case, that's a good solution here. this is pretty nitpicky and nerdy, isn't it?
Yeah, you're spending way more time thinking about this than most of us will. You know, it's like, wow, that's some maths.
It is, but that's still the back door that if someone was motivated to find this, they could, right? So what I just showed you, the solution there, that's called suppression. Okay, and that's, like I said, it's removing some data in cells they have unique characteristics or very small numbers, and removing that so that you can't go back and do some math and figure out who those people are. Okay. Another technique that you can use when you're presenting data like this is something called blurring. All we're really doing is reducing the precision of our data. So instead of giving the exact percentage, like maybe we want to do a range. Or instead of like all these exact categories of students, we maybe would have like white and Hispanic and, you know, Asian and other, or whatever, combine groups in different ways. You're in any way that you can reduce the precision of the data so that it's not, you can't drill down so specifically into specific groups of students. That can also help you avoid unwanted disclosure. So those are two, I'm kind of rushing this now because I really want to get to some of our scenarios. And if you've been quiet, you're going to have to speak up for the next ones, or else this is not going to be fun. Are there any questions about suppression and blurring?
Not specific
really
to
just
that.
want,
Carol's got a question in the chat about PLO artifacts for our PLO assessment, and I tried to answer it, but you're very welcome to add in.
yeah, so generally speaking, so I see your answer that it's only shared internally, and that's okay. And generally speaking, that's true, except for if we were to submit that information to our accreditor. Now, anything that we're submitting, we are going through and reviewing and redacting information. So it's not like we're just going to send it out as is. But sometimes there are people who have access to that information that maybe really aren't supposed to. So it's probably okay, but if you really want to be safe, then you should try to redact as much as possible, or again, report aggregate results and not anything individual if possible. Again, that's being overly cautious, but sometimes overly cautious is better than having to deal with consequences of oopsies. Any other questions? This example I showed you, I really just wanted to share with you how easy it would be to inadvertently
Yeah, I
share
had a
information.
question for you.
Sure. Go ahead.
Sometimes we get emails from other colleges and universities asking us to take a survey, asking us to share some of our data. And that feels like, that's very targeted. I want to be helpful to them and share some information, but I typically don't answer any requests like that because, it just feels like it's too much of a risk. But is that the right thing to do? I want to maintain student privacy and not share the wrong thing.
Yeah, so if that happens and someone is outside of the college is asking for information that would involve student information, if you want to be helpful, you're right to be concerned about student privacy, and I love that that you're thinking about that. But if you also want to be helpful, one thing you can do is you can forward their request to me, or you can ask them to contact me, because officially any kind of request for outside data is going to get funneled to my office. And what happens is I will review that and consult with
Yeah. And
other
the
parties.
the types of requests that I get are typically like they want some data related to interpreting, some very specific data related to, this very small group of people or this program. So
It
sorry.
should, we can help them, but it's always best to have them go through an official channel. And that way we know that what they're asking for and anything that we share or that you share has been properly vetted. So we can still be helpful, but we can also protect the student privacy.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Good.
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. Anything else? All right. So I have a couple of scenarios. Actually, I have three. We'll see how many we can get through. These are just, I have not put any kind of, I'm just telling you something that has happened. And I'd like you to go through, think about this scenario, and let's talk about whether each person has protected, whether they've really done a good job protecting student data, or if you see any kind of flaws or things that they have forgotten to do. Okay. So I'll give you a moment to read through scenario one. Okay, has everyone had a chance to read through? Okay. Is Claude in the clear? Has he followed rules or everything related to FERPA that he should? Are there any kind of, maybe he's made a mistake, or there's some things he hasn't considered in what he's done?
This is Carol. So if he writes their names in the footnote, it's in the paper and it's publishing their names associated with the class.
Yeah, exactly. And he's shared their work. He's talked about their work. And it's not clear from this paragraph to what extent, but he's used their work in this publication. Is there any way that Claude could make this right, could fix this, or is this something he just should not ever do ever?
I guess if he had a written agreement with each student by name that he could use their work and their name in the paper. But other
Yeah.
than that, if he didn't have that,
You're absolutely right. If he had gone to each of these students and said, hey, I would like to use the work that we have done or that you have done in this chemistry class, and I'd like to include that in a paper that I'm submitting to this education journal. And I'd like to both use your work and thank you publicly, have your name in there associated with this work. Is that okay with you? And you would want to have a signed consent from each one of those students in order to do what he has done here. So be mindful of that. This is another situation when I say that whenever you're sharing information outside of the college, to at least check in with your supervisor. That's another check to make sure that what you're doing is consistent with the regulations about protecting student data. All right, so Carol, you nailed that one. Let's look at another case. All right, this is about a presentation given at a conference. So again, I'll give you a minute to look through this. Any thoughts about Ms. Laveau and her presentation?
I'm giving it a thumbs down.
Okay. And why are you giving it a thumbs down?
Because I think that she just started to get, like, she was moving in the right direction, but I don't think she blacked out enough information. If she's still got the access to all those other personal identifying indicators, then somebody could probably still figure out who those students were if they were trying to dig into it. So I think she needs to black out more than just their name.
Yeah, she definitely does. That's a lot of different information that maybe each one by itself wouldn't reveal the identity, but in combination, it potentially could identify who that student is. And that goes back to that complicated part of personally identifiable information, where you have to be mindful of the combination of information that you're providing. It is good that she did go ahead and black out the student names. I've been in a conference where someone was showing output from a colleague that did not black out anything, and it was a real student. And they had to go and they used the method that I don't approve of, which is to use a marker to try to hide it, which it wasn't really hidden. But so, yeah, you should be mindful of things like this, even when you're at a friendly conference like the community college system, right? All right, so let's move on. I've got one more for you. Here's scenario 3. So take a minute to read over and let me know what you think. All right, Carol's already thumbs down. Why is that? Or no,
I
was that for
think
the other one?
just because he has access to it doesn't mean he can use it. He still needs to get permissions.
You're absolutely right. Even when you do, he has access based on his role as an instructor, not as a researcher. So it's not permissible for him to use his student performance in his research. He needs to have official permission to use it as a researcher. The other part of this is that when he goes to get that permission, he is most likely also going to have to go under an IRB review as well. So remember that there are a lot of times, especially in community college, where people are enrolled in doctorate programs or getting other types of degrees where they are doing research, and you do have to get specific permission, even if you are an employee, even if you work with those actual students that you're getting the data from, you do need extra permission to use that information in a way that's not directly related to your role at the college. So any other questions or concerns about this? Any of the scenarios, anything about FERPA, or any of the other pieces that we've talked about today?
You
So-
covered so much, Jessica. This has been really, really helpful.
Yeah, it is a lot. But, once
I
you
have
kind
a
of get used to it and
question.
think about it. Yeah, what was that?
Then I have a question. It's about the registration in the area of the registration. You know, I work with a lot of students, Latin students, that sometimes when I help to in registration because it's a lot of issues with the translate the information from these students. But sometimes when they have questions about residents, about the documents, I feel a little, it's like I don't feel good when I ask them all these questions about their residents, about of this process. How the Blue Ridge College protects this information about their residents' status?
So that's a great question. There are exceptions to FERPA where the college would have to release information about a student, which could include the student's address or their residency, if it came from was related to a subpoena or other kind of law enforcement. So in those cases, we would have to release that information, and we couldn't say, sorry, no, you can't see that because of FERPA. So there are some exceptions to that. So I don't have a great answer, unfortunately, for handling that. Yeah. So yeah, if it's related to law enforcement or some sort of a legal proceeding, then
And
FERPA goes
I'm
away.
sorry,
Exception.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have to step away. Is it okay if I go ahead and leave the session?
Yes, thanks, Michelle. And I know we're up against our time. You're welcome to stay on the call if Jessica has a couple more minutes, folks, but I am going to stop the recording and thank all of you for attending.